The sun seared the cocoa fields, and a single truth pulsed through the dust that clung to the village. She had been cast away, and yet someone would cross the thin line between obligation and love to save what mattered most. It was 1879, a humid afternoon in the interior, where the air smelled of ripe cacao and the river moved slow as if time itself hesitated. In that small district of Santa Lucia, people measured fortunes by the weight of a sack of beans and sins by the volume of gossip. Maria, 26 years old, had grown under the shadow of a house that never learned the language of affection, and she moved through rooms as if her feet were ghosts, touching the boards with the quiet knowledge of someone who had been told she was worth little. She had been left on a stoop as an infant, taken in by Aunt Rosa, fed on porridge and scorn, and taught to smooth wrinkles in linen while other children learned to speak their names with pride. On the other side of the plantation stood Señor Duarte, a widowed farmer whose face had been carved by sun and command, a man who held power like one holds a walking stick, and who would climb his porch each morning, measuring his world for threats. His son, little Pedro, had fallen ill with a fever that would not answer simple cures, and no medicine from the nearest town could give sufficient hope. Under the weight of fear, Señor Duarte had to consider a desperate remedy that would redraw the lines of his household. From a small life of dust and chores arose a marriage arranged by quiet bargains and louder whispers. And within weeks of the alliance, the village would witness a story of suffering, loyalty, prejudice, and an unexpected redemption. If stories of second chances warm your heart, subscribe and join a community that values mercy and resilience. The first time Maria heard the name Pedro spoken with anything other than command, it felt like rain after months of drought, as if a voice had opened a window inside her chest and let a sliver of light in. There was a scent of boiled herbs, an echo of church bells, and a charrette wheel grinding against the yard stones as the man came to the small door where she scrubbed. The opening was short, but it contained the fulcrum of a life that would not be the same. In the kitchen, a rooster called from a fence, and the coffee simmered in a pot that had stained rings like the record of a humble life. Maria reached for a cloth and for a moment felt the cotton grain like a memory under her fingers. "You there?" the man said, his voice both rough and accidentally soft. "My son needs rest. His nurse is not well with the fever, and I was told you know about herbs." She answered with the careful reserve of someone used to being corrected in private. "I know how to boil and strain. I know how to sing a child to sleep." He looked at her with something that was not exactly pity and not exactly ownership, a recognition of needed skill. "Do you ask for coin?" she wondered, and the question sat in the air, tasting like metal. "No," he said. "I ask for your hands and your steadiness. Come tomorrow, bring what you have." The invitation was thin, but within it lay a hinge that would swing entire households. Maria remembered the day she had been left, the cashmere shawl that had been too fine for a baby, the way the midwife had clutched her throat and looked away. She remembered playing under the cocoa trees while the other children rode on their father's shoulders. Those childhood memories occurred like a set of small rooms in her mind, each with its own light. She had learned early that her life was to be service and silence, to master the kitchen and to move quick when called, to braid hair with hands that trembled because the pulse of abandonment still beat. The second chapter of her backstory was school of necessity more than education, the way a child learns the sound of tools and the names of plants. There had been a teacher once, an itinerant called Manuel, who read from worn sheets of paper about faraway cities. He had given Maria a single line of hope by teaching her to read a prayer. Manuel had said, "Knowledge is a small rebellion," and she had held that lesson like a secret flower. The third part of her past was loss and shaming. The winter a cousin died after a fever took hold, and the family murmured that death was a punishment for being different. In that loss, Maria learned the shape of grief, how it sits like a stone in the belly, and how you still had to prepare the next meal. The present had a quiet around it that felt both settled and volatile, a place where a word could move everyone like wind through drying clothes. Señor Duarte, the farmer, had been raised to consider provision the highest virtue. He had a stern sister, Donna Elisa, who managed accounts and kept lists with a pencil that made little mountains of mistakes into order. There was Juan the capataz, who wore his authority like a second skin and listened to the earth with hands that smelled of rum and iron. There was Padre Miguel, who conducted mass with a voice that smoothed quarrels, and Dr. Silva, who traveled from Salvador with a bag of instruments and an air of modernity that unsettled the villagers. "You will need proper diagnosis, not just traditions," he had declared. There was Batista, a neighbor who ran the market stall and knew every gossip by the shape of its hushed syllables. And young Mariana, who worked in the sewing room and considered Maria a friend, though she dared not show it publicly. There was Capanga Rui, a man of muscle and few words, who did the heavy work and whose glance could freeze a room. All these names would play into the movement of the story, each altering tone, each a small stone that altered the river path. In the early days of the fever, there were small rituals. The child lay in white sheets that smelled faintly of lemon and violets, and Maria sat nearby with a cloth of camphor against his small brow, fingers warm and steady. "He is burning," Señor Duarte would say, pacing the floorboards and listening to the thin violin string of the child's breath. "Bring more water. Open the window." The house felt full of air that was too hot and a humidity that seemed intent on pushing every breath into labor. Maria would roll her sleeves, the coarse linen against her wrists, and speak in a tone meant to catch sleep. "Rest now, Pedro. Remember the mango tree by the well." The child's eyelids fluttered and he murmured, "Mango," like a prayer. The first week passed with small improvements and then setbacks, and each setback felt like an indictment of those who had power to help but lacked imagination. The town sent word of a physician from Salvador, Dr. Silva, who arrived with leather bags and instruments that clinked like small bells. He took Pedro's pulse with fingers that were cool and professional, and he frowned as the sun set behind his shoulders. "This is not a common fever," he said. "We must consider complications. I will try a serum and rest, but he will need constant care." The notion of serum was foreign to the aunt who drew water with a pail, and to Juan who measured coffee with a rough thumb. Yet it offered a sliver of hope. With the arrival of outside medicine came tension between that which was new and that which had always worked by touch and memory. Aunt Rosa muttered prayers and counted rosary beads, while Maria prepared poultices of guaco and eucalyptus with precise hands. Her fingers worked methodically as she cracked leaves between her palms and inhaled the bitter perfume of herbs, the scent rising and joining with the acrid smoke of the kitchen hearth. "You are stubborn, child," Dr. Silva said once, looking at Maria as she stirred the concoction. "Do not let tradition blind you. Bring me the sample of his vomit. We will test for complications." Maria hesitated at the word sample, as if it were a sacrament she had no right to touch. The villagers gathered rumor like shells at low tide. Some thought Maria's touch might be folk magic. Others thought her a nuisance, while a few, such as Batista and Mariana, believed in her quietly and offered small courtesies, like a wrapped tamale or a cheek brushed with sympathy. Scenes of daily life were dense with senses. The porch morning brought the sharp smell of horse and leather. Mid-morning offered the warm roundness of fresh bread and the sticky sweetness of mango. Mid-afternoon held the distant sound of a child laughing at the sugarcane field and the metallic clang when the blacksmith struck iron. And evenings had the smoky, sweet scent of quintal from a cookpot where sugar dissolved into celebration. When the first real improvement came, it did so like the first rain after a drought, sudden and miraculous, and it pulled the villagers up from their stoops to whisper of miracles or of well-timed medicines. Pedro opened his eyes clearer than before, and a small smile curved like a sunrise. "He ate a slice of bread," Señor Duarte said, voice momentarily gone soft. Maria felt a warmth come into her chest like molten metal cooled into gold. They all exhaled. At that moment, we asked you to join the conversation. If this scene made your chest tighten with hope, or if you have ever seen a small recovery change the life of an entire place, leave a comment beginning with "I forgive" or "I remember" to share how a small kindness once changed everything in your life. Your words will help build the next tale we bring to life. The village reacted with a tide of relief and with a new current of envy. Where there had been scorn, there now emerged curiosity and some measure of grudging respect. This turning gave room for the next phase to develop, and for characters like Donna Eliza and Kapanga Rui to alter their stances. Donna Eliza, who had only ever counted books and debts, found herself bringing a cloth with lavender to the bedside, and then leaving quickly as if to protest softness with a small cough. Kapanga Rui, who rarely spoke, began to sit a little longer on the steps of the sugar house and to watch Maria with a contemplative squint. The community names multiplied into action. Padre Miguel came with bread and a silent prayer. Dr. Silva kept notes in a leather book and scheduled a return visit. Batista sent news from the market and offered to pay for any medicine if needed. Mariana mended sheets and told Maria of her secret plan to teach sewing to the younger girls, and Juan the capataz adjusted the schedules of labor to allow someone to watch the child. Not everyone was pleased. A local power broker, Coronel Macedo, who had influence over the roads and over petty law, watched the softening of attitude toward Maria like a storm watching a fragile hut. Macedo had long considered the ordering of things a personal domain, and any disruption of hierarchy pricked him with irritation. He had reasons more than social to oppose Maria and her new place. Her recognition threatened the small black markets of influence Macedo controlled, and it risked showing how compassion could subvert custom. He began to whisper suspicion into ears like dry leaves, and small acts of sabotage began to arrive with the mail. The first sign of malice was a smear of bitter oil on the sugar barrels so that a batch spoiled at the mill. The second act was a slander in the parlor, where a letter accused Maria of theft with words that smelled of rancid jealousy. Those accusations were thrown like pebbles, and they rippled out until Señor Duarte had to hold a meeting at the large table with plates of roasted meat, and the sound of the wind flowing through the open windows. "Who dares to say this?" he demanded, and some answered with silence, while others like Batista defended Maria with the stubborn loyalty of a man who counted debts in people. "You will not let slander turn away what was earned by care," Batista said, voice low. A confrontation at the market brought the matter into public light when Macedo's nephew loudly accused Maria of witchcraft, saying, "She speaks to the plants and calls away the sickness for coin." Maria, who had been handing over a bundle of stitched shirts to Mariana, felt the words like thorns, and she turned with quiet fury. "I do not speak to take coin," she replied, standing straighter than she had in years. "I bind leaves because a child needs a breath." The market hushed as if a furnace had cooled. The tension rose to a point where social rituals could no longer smooth the cloth of community. The capataz Joan took the stand for Maria, pointing to the fact that she had slept by the bedside for nights without asking for reward. "If you would question her, ask the child," he said. "Ask Pedro if he remembers who stayed." Pedro, pale and thin but alert, blinked at the gathering and said in a small, clear voice, "Maria sang." That small confession redirected the tide of opinion, at least among those who were disposed to listen. The rivalry then escalated through a sequence of deliberate acts intended to humiliate and remove Maria from the household. The first was a smear campaign that placed a stolen brooch in the corner of the sewing room and timed its discovery to embarrass Maria when the baroness of a neighboring estate came to visit. The second was an economic pressure placed upon Señor Duarte by Macedo through control of the cacao buyers, subtly threatening to divert trade unless certain households conformed to old hierarchies. These moves were not merely social games, they were strategic. Macedo had men among the buyers and among the roadmasters, and he could choke commerce like a hand over a throat. Yet each move he made deepened resistance among the workers who had watched Maria tend to Pedro with humble devotion. They began to talk in kitchens and behind closed doors, naming Macedo's moves and considering small countermeasures. Plans were made quietly. Batista agreed to track deliveries and to ensure smaller clients still reached Duarte. Mariana arranged to hide fresh provisions in the sewing basket, and João planned to keep a watchful eye on the docks. Despite these precautions, danger came in the middle of a festival when the town lit fires and the music of pipes filled the night. The Festival of St. Anthony had always been a place where reputations could be burnished or blackened, and on that night Macedo chose to act. A bowl of stew intended for the household found its way to the child's mouth after a series of obstructions and secret switches. The stew tasted normal at first, savory with the warmth of cumin, but within hours the symptoms returned with an unnatural severity. Pedro began to convulse as if some inner furnace had been stoked, the skin flushed and the breath snatched like a bellows. Maria rushed to him, cold sweat upon her forehead, and Dr. Silva arrived with instruments clinking. "There is poison," he said, after inspecting the vomit and observing the pattern of symptoms. Not enough to kill if treated early, but enough to harm and to complicate his recovery. The village reeked of panic. Someone ran to the river for water, another knocked over a lamp in haste, and the notes of the fiddle turned into a thin whining sound as music faltered. This was the first moment of high tension, a pulse of fear that enlarged and pushed memory to the forefront. Maria clenched a small locket she had always worn and remembered the childhood when hunger had been a constant companion. She thought of Manuel teaching her to read and of his soft voice saying a wise line about endurance. She recollected the sound of her aunt's scolding and the warmth of a single embrace that had belonged to an old woman in the market who had once put a palm upon her head and said, "Child, you will be needed." These memories folded into her actions as she set to work, giving herbs and binding poultices while Dr. Silva prepared an antidote with meticulous steps. He strained a decoction of activated charcoal mixed with neutralizing agents and gave small doses intravenously, instructing servants to monitor temperature and pulse. The description of the treatment was precise. It included the gentle insertion of a small glass tube into a thin vein, the steady drip of a saline solution, and the careful measurement of doses based on weight and the nature of the toxin. The procedural explanation filled the air with the clinical scent of alcohol and the metallic tang of instruments, and it comforted some and frightened others. A short investigation began immediately, led quietly by João and Batista, who examined market receipts, questioned the provider of cooking supplies, and followed rumor trails into taverns where low men traded secrets for cavaquinho songs. They found that a crate of spices had been tampered with and that the delivery route had been altered the week before. Evidence surfaced slowly like light through curtains, Dr. Silva confirmed. The presence of a toxic alkaloid and a note in the trail hinted at Macedo's involvement when a delivery had been rerouted through intermediaries known to the coronel. When confronted in a public square, Macedo laughed and demanded proof. The confrontation was a set piece of a community choosing sides, full of sensory detail. Dust spiraled in a sunbeam, someone spat near the well, and the taste of bitter coffee lingered on tongues. "You accuse me?" Macedo shouted, his voice a wave of heat. "On what basis?" João, steady as a post, presented receipts and an eyewitness who recognized a man in Macedo's employ at the time of the tampering. "We will bring this to the captain of the town," Batista insisted. The townspeople murmured that the Capitane do Mato would involve difficult politics, yet some vowed to seek justice. Tension changed into a plan for retaliation that was careful and detailed. Maria, who had felt small and powerless, began to speak with a voice that was clear and simultaneously soft. "If justice is what you want, let the evidence be weighed. Let us not turn to violence." Her words had the effect of a cool hand upon a feverish forehead. The next phase involved gathering witnesses and documents, a slow legal choreography that required signatures, sworn statements, and the help of Padre Miguel, who was asked to verify certain testimonies. The procedural description of the legal steps was concise and instructive. Declarations were written in ink, witnesses were asked to swear on a Bible that they told the truth, and the local magistrate scheduled a hearing to present the evidence. The hearings were held under a cedar tree because the courthouse roof leaked, and the air smelled of cedar shavings and burned kerosene. The primary moment of escalation arrived when Macedo attempted to retaliate with greater cruelty. He hired a small group of ruffians to spirit Pedro away from the house in the night. The night was thick with the smell of damp earth and the sound of frogs, and the thieves moved like shadows between stacks of cacao sacks. Maria woke to the absence like a physical blow and ran into the yard, hair wild and heart pounding as if it had been hollowed out and then refilled with sharp stones. "Pedro is gone," she cried. The house erupted into plans and curses. Señor Duarte fumbled with a lantern and called Kapanga Rui, who sprinted down the path. The pursuit was frantic, the chase spanning cane fields that emitted the scent of crushed green and the sound of boots on dry soil. The ransackers had moved quickly, and their tracks were partially erased by the press of wheels, yet Batista and João found a scrap of cloth caught on a fence and a shoe print that led toward a known stop of Macedo's men. The rescue attempt was a striking two-paragraph span of action and emotion. Maria remembered that childhood thought again, Manel's whisper about courage, and she felt small hands of memory lifting her forward like hidden wings. She breathed and shouted, "Hold! Stop!" as they cornered the men at a small abandoned shed near the river. The ruffians were surprised to find the villagers there, not just the farmer and his hired hands, but women with rolling pins and shopkeepers with clubs, all of whom had gathered in a spontaneous show of solidarity. "Release the child," Señor Duarte demanded, his voice a broken baritone of command mixed with raw plea. One of the men laughed and spat. "You have no proof of our orders," he sneered. But the footprint evidence and Batista's witness testimony pinned the small men like insects under glass. "We have witnesses," João said, showing the cloth and the shoe print. There was a tense scrap of physicality where Kapanga Rui grabbed the leader by the collar and held him so close that the man's breath smelled of sour liquor. "Tell us who sent you," Rui demanded. The man, croaking and seeing guilt like a wall of heat before him, named Macedo and insisted that he had been offered coin. The confession was enough to bring local constables to take the men into custody and to present the confession to the magistrate. The public exposure of Macedo's involvement changed the tide dramatically. People who had feared his influence found resilience in each other's presence, and Macedo began to lose small allies. The magistrate, sensing the weight of evidence and the town's mood, ordered a formal investigation. The procedural record described the confiscation of records and the subpoenaing of buyers and sellers in a way that mimicked a town slowly learning to use paperwork as armor. During the investigation, more names surfaced, including an intermediary who had long benefited from Macedo's patronage and who now turned witness in exchange for leniency. The accusations reached their peak during a packed hearing beneath the cedar tree, where witnesses testified with trembling voices, and where Maria, called to the stand, spoke with a clarity that surprised everyone. "I only did what any woman would for a child," she said, her voice steady, the dust of the courtyard motes in a light that looked like tiny ships. The scene was a long stretch of testimony and cross-examination, full of sensory detail. The scratch of a quill pen, the metallic clink of a chain as someone adjusted their watch, the bitter odor of pipe smoke from a nervous witness. The climactic enforcement of justice came when the magistrate, after deliberation that tasted of coffee and old leather, pronounced that Macedo and his accomplices would be detained pending trial, and that confiscated goods would be returned to the rightful owners. This moment was a release of a pressure valve.
People who had been holding their breath breathed out as if they had been underwater for decades. There was an earthly catharsis when the hired men were led away with ropes, and when Macedo, flanked by wordless guards, looked, not like a powerful overlord, but like a man stripped of tools. He tried to protest, to deny, to call upon old alliances. But the evidence had weight, and the town had voice. In the wake of justice, the community shifted into repair. The social costs were measured, and the practical consequences addressed. Señor Duarte called a gathering to rebuild trust and to plan for the future of the estate and for Pedro's full recovery. Maria, once the invisible seamstress of the house, began to be seen in small new ways. She was asked to teach herbs and to keep a small ledger of treatments, and her knowledge of plants began to be valued beyond superstition. Dr. Silva offered to write a small pamphlet about the uses of guaco and eucalyptus, and about the circumstances in which seeking clinical care was essential. The pamphlet included clear procedural language about when to take a child to a physician, how to monitor fever, and the importance of quantifying doses. It instructed caregivers to observe pulse and respiration, to avoid mixtures of certain substances, and to seek immediate help if convulsions occurred. The disciplinary detail was both practical and gentle in tone, and totaled a concise explanatory section of the work. Rebuilding also meant changing seasons of prejudice. Donna Elisa, who had once avoided Maria's glances, arranged a small place in the house for the woman's bundle of herbs and asked that she teach Mariana and other young girls how to prepare basic poultices. "You will take notes," she said, with a mix of command and respect, "and you will write it down so no knowledge is lost." Maria accepted and began to set ink to paper again, writing with a slow but sure hand. The final block of transformation led to personal reconciliations and to the beginnings of public redemption. An event was scheduled to celebrate the harvest and to announce a new fund for public health, funded by donations from small merchants and from Señor Duarte, who had learned the cost of neglect. On a mild evening, the town held a celebration with tamales, roasted sweet potatoes, and the warm tang of cuento spiced with cinnamon. The air was festive and the mood tentative. There was music that sounded like a river and a series of short speeches. Padre Miguel spoke of forgiveness and the communal duty to protect the weak. Batista announced the formation of a small clinic fund. Dr. Silva presented a small box of instruments to be kept at the parsonage. During the ceremony, Señor Duarte surprised many by publicly acknowledging that he had been wrong to listen only to those who reinforced hierarchy. "A man can own lands," he said, voice gravelly, "but that does not mean he owns the hearts of those who live upon them." He turned to Maria and said, "You came to us because a child needed you. You have my thanks and my protection." The protection was not simply rhetorical. It carried with it social consequence and material support. Maria was offered a small room near the house with a chest and a table and a place to store her herbs. She was given a small stipend from the harvest proceeds so she could buy seeds and begin to teach. The final shifts of the tale followed the arc to a personal reunion and a quiet love. Over months, the small exchanges between Maria and Señor Duarte softened from formality to warmth, from duty to respect, and from respect to a kind complicity. The progress was slow as sap, but steady as a candled wick. Scenes of domestic intimacy were written with care. They included the scent of coffee poured slowly at dawn, the clink of porcelain, the brush of hands over a wound that was more of guilt than of skin, and the quiet of two people learning a new language of care. Their dialogues, numerous and intimate, were like small trades in a market of forgiveness. "You have taught me to listen," he admitted once, "when the sun was gold on the sugar cane. You have taught me to find mercy in small things." Maria answered gently, "You taught me that a man can change his mind when he sees the truth." They shared laughter that tasted like fresh bread, and nights where silence was not cold but companionable. Their relationship was not a sudden blaze but a steady hearth. Secondary characters continued to shape the village life with named involvement. Mariana began a small school for girls where she taught sewing and reading. Padre Miguel recorded the names of donors and students. Dr. Silva returned seasonally to teach new techniques. João modernized tasks at the mill to be more efficient and humane. Batista kept watch on market fairness. Dona Elisa wrote a small ledger of redemption that recorded instances of justice. And Kapanga Rui, who had once been a stoic laborer, married a widow from the market and settled down with surprising tenderness. There remained those who held a grudge, including a remnant of Macedo's allies who muttered in bars, but their influence shrank like old shade under a new dawn. The narrative wound into an epilogue that looked across 3 moments of time and measured the change. 1 month later, the harvest was modest, but the house had a new rhythm. Pedro walked with a steady of step, laughing sometimes with a sound that made the household breathe easier. Maria kept a small journal where she recorded herbs and recipes and the names of children who came for care. She wrote, "I count hands that help and I keep them like seeds." The community gathered to clear the land beside the parsonage and to mark the place where a small clinic would be started. 3 months after the events, the clinic officially opened with a simple ribbon made of cotton. Dr. Silva taught basic hygiene, Pedro attended and handed out water cups to the younger children, and Mariana taught a class of girls how to sew sterile cloths. The festival for the opening smelled of freshly baked loaves and of flowers clipped from neighbor yards, and it felt like a public vow that the town had learned a small lesson in compassion. 6 months later, the change had taken root deeper than anyone expected. The harvest increased because buyers returned who had been convinced by Batista that the quality was worth loyalty. Children were healthier because the clinic had distributed advice about fever management and had a small stock of basic medicines. Maria had become a central figure in the small school, teaching herbs and reading, and she had expanded her chest with notebooks filled with observations of plants like guaco and eucalyptus and their preparation. Pedro, now bright and mischievous, ran through the courtyard and climbed the mango tree as if to reclaim childhood. Senor Duarte, older but lighter in step, walked beside Maria in the farm rows and spoke to workers with a newfound humility. The legacy had multiplied beyond a single household. It had become part of the communal vocabulary. In the aftermath, the town also recorded practical reforms. A small code about market fair dealing was put into place, and weekly meetings were scheduled to discuss disputes so that power could not be wielded secretly. Legal documents were archived, and a small fund was established to aid families in need. That practical outcome had an emotional resonance. The people felt safer and more dignified, and the small clinic grew into a place of learning. The story closed with a moment of quiet reflection that tied the personal to the communal. Maria stood beneath the old cedar and watched the children play, feeling the breeze that brought the scent of cocoa and the distant hum of a mill. She held in her hand a ribbon from the clinic opening and remembered being a child who had once been anonymous and invisible. "I did not choose to be abandoned," she thought, "but I chose to be present." She had been given an opportunity to turn abandonment into belonging, and that choice had led to a life that carried a warm and steady meaning. If this tale moved you, and if you believe in the quiet power of care, subscribe to follow more stories that show how small acts can change entire towns. Unveiling this improbable love had been less about romance than about recognition, and the final scene closed with the community gathering under the stars, a pot of quintal simmering, children with cheeks dusted in flour and laughter, and Senor Duarte and Maria standing side by side with hands tentatively touching, as if to promise that the past would not define their future.